Evening, Mr. Patnaik. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you. First of all, let me compliment you for this great book that you've written, Pandemic Disruptions and Odisha's Lessons in Governance, Public Health, Data Protection, and other essays. For the benefit of viewers, this is the lovely book which my colleague, uh, a member of the Council of States from Odisha, has penned. And today we are going to have a conversation with him about the book. So, Dr. Patnaik, what actually impelled you to write this book?
Manish, first of all, thank you so much for speaking all those generous words on this book. During the time of the pandemic, at least during the first wave when there was a hard lockdown, one realized that the interaction with party colleagues or even with peers, friends, was very limited. It was almost non-existent during the first few months. So that's when I decided that I'll write about what's happening about each of the facets of the pandemic as it unravels. Let's say first about the big question relating to having those isolation wards. So that was the issue. So I started writing about isolation wards and started sending it to newspapers with suggestions and what Odisha has done in terms of setting those centers, improvising. Everyone was improvising at that time. So Odisha, how it was improvising it, that is how it all started. And then I realized that the pandemic, which was beyond everyone's ken in terms of understanding when things would happen or what would happen, one realized that it's not just a question of health. In the first few days, you would realize that the massive influx of people came who migrant laborers coming into the states, and particularly Odisha, Assam, West Bengal. That's where the migrant workers used to go to the rest of the country. So they all started coming back, and that was a human problem. And that problem was relating to not really. One was, of course, the pandemic, to maintain social distance, to have the testing done at various points. But more important was to provide food to them, to those people who are in the villages and who were getting cooked food from government. That was also not possible at that time. So how we managed to give them cooked food through the women self-help groups. So one realized that this pandemic's the entire impact was not just limited to the health sector, but various sectors. And that is when I started writing about the different sectors as well. Food distribution. The third aspect was relating to, someone came up to me asking for blood. He's a thalassemia patient. They need to take blood at regular intervals. They can't go to the hospital. And if they went to the hospital, there was no blood there. So I wrote about thalassemia. I wrote about blood. I came out in the television on the shortage of blood. And our party took this stand at that time that the entire party cadre would, bring some amount of peril to them in terms of not, going out into the open to the blood bank to give blood. Because there was social distancing, contact was strictly a no-no. But they went and we collected a huge amount of blood from the party cadres themselves and stuffed our blood banks with that blood. So that was a very innovative way of doing it. So I thought I'll write about it. So that is how different aspects of the pandemic, I kept on writing. The first wave, the second wave, the vaccination, the entire aspect. So this is one thing that that initially struck me to write. But then at the same time, if you remember, you were also in the same committee on the personal data protection. Even during the pandemic, you must have been coming from Punjab, I was coming from Odisha, to attend those meetings almost on a regular basis every week. We took that call because this was a thing that has to be done. So I wrote a little bit about the data protection aspect. That was important because, you see, during the time we are talking about privacy, there were people who were scared of revealing their names of having been infected with COVID. We heard at that time people coming from different states and keeping quiet. So there was a situation in Odisha where a particular person was detected with the virus, but he was not revealing who he had traveled with, who he was in contact with, and you know, a call was taken by the government, and that call was that we will divulge his name, because in that case, people who are in contact with him would probably come forward and get the sums checked, and this is what happened. So I wrote a piece on the right to life over right to privacy, which is important. So if a bigger community's health issue is involved, then maybe individual privacy will have to take a backseat. So that is how it started.
So it's very interesting. If you recall that when the lockdown was announced at a 4-hour notice, Parliament was in session. Many of us could not make it back to our constituencies for the first 2 months. So it's interesting that were you able to travel back to Bhubaneswar or were you stuck here?
Would you believe this? That was the last flight I took. The moment I heard that this is what is going to happen, I remember I was traveling back from the Parliament to my house, and while traveling itself, I was trying to book the ticket because I thought this would probably be the last flight, and I couldn't get the ticket. So I called up a travel agent in Bhubaneswar to book a ticket for me and send it to me, and he did that. So the last flight to Bhubaneswar I could take was on the, I think, 25th or the 26th of March. And after going there, since my old parents are there, so I realized, and since this was the first time we were facing such a kind of a situation after about 100 years, the Spanish flu. So I stayed in a guest house. And I stayed in a guest house, but one never knew whether it was 14 days or 21 days. If you remember at that initial time, they were saying different days were being prescribed by doctors as to how many days you should stay in isolation. So I preferred to stay in isolation for about a month in a guest house. And that was my old AG's office guest house where I used to work earlier. And that is where I had so much of time. So I thought, let me write all this thing. And I started from there, actually.
If one was to actually revisit those times, and you've done an excellent job, chronicling history as it unfolded. The one thing which struck me, and I would like to have your experiences on it, that confronted with a once in a century pandemic, the response actually was very local rather than being at a state, national, or even at an international level. India turned into almost 600,000 autonomous republics. Each village was really trying to find its own way to cope with that. At least that was my experience in my constituency, and I represent a rural constituency. Was that your experience too?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, in the first wave, I remember the villages with the limited knowledge that an infected person can infect the entire village. Even for their own men who had gone to the cities, nearby cities, they were not allowed to come in unless they sat or they stayed in a house outside the village perimeter, in a secluded house for about 14, 15 days. They put all these bamboo barricades in villages, and each one started governing. And that is when the government of Odisha did a very smart thing. I think the first time. We gave the power of the district magistrate to the sarpanch. So the result is, while the community response happened in terms of what I just mentioned, not restricting the flow of people from outside the village to their own village. In case there was a deviation, some people might just be forcing themselves into the village. This power given to the sarpanch ensured that these people were picked up and forcibly asked to isolate. So this, what you are saying, is absolutely correct, that this was the biggest learning experience in terms of building community resilience, community response and resilience, developing that resilience in response to a global pandemic. The governments had very little to do except issuing circulars, but the people of the country, they only responded. So if anybody has to give credit to having managed the pandemic well to India, I think the biggest credit must go to the people of this country, to those communities in the villages, 60,000 republics, each one becoming a republic, And in states like Odisha, where we give this power to the Sarpanch, he became the district magistrate of his, the number of villages that was there in that panchayat. And he ensured that because during the first wave, there was no vaccine. It was purely, avoiding contact and following the restrictions of hand wash, having these masks, wearing masks. You wouldn't believe, we use those women's self-help groups to make masks and distribute it to the community themselves. Because if you remember, at that time, people even didn't know that where the masks are available. There's a few kind of states and few places where some masks were available. So the cloth masks, which was developed at that time, but later people said that this was not good enough. You came out with this
N95.
N95 and all this mass. So I think so this is what I've captured in this book. So people with the limited knowledge of the they didn't know about genome sequencing. They did not know about that this virus is such that there are no vaccines so developed so far for them. This is very different, in which people's lungs were getting affected. Since India is a young country, they would not have seen the Spanish flu. So I think the way it happened in our country, particularly in our state, the all over the country for that matter, the primary health care services are extremely poor all over the country to handle even the first response to someone suffering from the initial symptoms of the disease. But the exercises that were told, that you do proning, you do all these improvisations, that was coming from the villages, communities themselves, and that is what they were following. So I think we must give a huge amount of credit in our country to the people of this country, and no one should hijack this from.
No, in fact, you're so absolutely correct, because one of the most colossal tragedies of all these people who actually make our metropolises and cities function found themselves to be complete strangers in their home and hearths. Some of them were forced out, and I think one thing which needs to be documented is that human tragedy of millions and millions of people trying to make it back to their villages on foot without any help from the state. And this is, I think, a story of great resilience, which should have actually impelled the government to really rethink the lockdown. Because if so many millions walked back home and got back safely to their home and hearth and survived the pandemic, then obviously the decision to announce such a harsh lockdown at a 4-hour notice is something at some point in time, don't you think that Parliament should revisit it?
See, I think there are two things here. The first thing is the human tragedy, and it was the travesty, I would say, of the pandemic, that in the face of increasing migration to urban areas, urban migration, that's the growth development model people talk about. This was the time when it came to life. People are running back to their earth, they're coming back to their villages, to their roots, and to survive, to get the food security, because food was not available in even was not coming to the cities. So while doing the harsh lockdown that India enforced during the first wave, there are two ways of looking at it. One, in hindsight, probably one could think that this was probably not called for, as it was probably proved later when government shifted gear and said local containment strategies would be the strategy forward, which could have been actually done even at that time. But giving due to the government, the fact that this is a once in 100-year kind of a pandemic, no one knew what was happening. No one also had an inkling of how to treat this. All kinds of medicines were being prescribed by doctors. The response of the government probably is understood to that extent, Having said so, however, I could say that since the alarm bells had rung even much before, all the inputs and the possible impacts of having a hard lockdown should have been factored in. The problem in India is that we don't do scenario planning at all. And for any kind of disaster, the kind of disaster that we are used to is a natural disaster like a cyclone or a flood or an earthquake. But this is a different kind of a disaster. And this is not just a natural disaster, this is a human disaster. So I think this is a good time, instead of just thinking that since the pandemic is probably over, which may not be true even, we will march forward. The idea of government is to have a revisit their Disaster Management Act to factor in this kind of natural disasters. And in such case, what is the kind of scenario planning? Scenario planning, not just in terms of migration of people, even in food distribution, in giving service delivery, in getting blood available to thalassemic patients, in ensuring that the domestic abuse of domestic violence doesn't happen because women were getting restricted to the same house in which the perpetrators were there. So these are the things, are the learning points. I really don't know whether this is what when we are currently thinking as a nation, looking at all these aspects and trying to have a strategy, an SOP, a governance protocol in place should another pandemic visit us.
That brings me to a very interesting question. Since you were a lawyer, and the one thing which struck me very early in the pandemic, and I remember writing a piece for the Hindustan Times, was the complete absence of a legal architecture to deal with this pandemic. So essentially, you had a one-page, 4-section act called the Indian Epidemics Act, enacted in 1898 to deal with the Spanish flu or calamities before that. And essentially, you managed the entire pandemic using the miscellaneous provisions in the National Disaster Management Act. And as you correctly said, that neither do we do scenario building and neither do we do a proper post-mortem of what we did right and what we did wrong. Even today, while most countries have enacted comprehensive legislation to deal with this situation, in fact, the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, even while the pandemic was playing itself out, had enacted legislation. The US Congress enacted legislation. We still continue to deal with it through executive action. And so don't you think that this needs to be remedied? And India needs to have a proper, comprehensive legal architecture to deal with the situation, which also provides safeguards so that civil liberties do not become a victim, as they did become during the COVID-19.
In fact, Manish, you'd be surprised to know that this is exactly what I have written in the book at 1.10, one particular article, one essay, page number 44, New Epidemic Control and Management Law Need of the Hour. And this I wrote almost during the first phase, precisely because of this, that there was just one Gujarat High Court and some High Court giving some stray orders. And the government was completely banking on this 4-page legislation of, I think, pre-independence and some miscellaneous pre-independence era. It is just going through executive instructions. And such executive instructions which have not been backed by, research, backed by scenario planning. And if you remember at the time that Arogya Setu came, which was a question of whether my data is going to be used by anybody else. So we needed some kind of a law for it. And at the time we were discussing the PDP bill. And what the government did at the time, I still remember, came out with some kind of a guideline protecting the privacy of the patients whose data is getting shared. But with this kind of guidelines, one can't take recourse to the law if this data was subsequently, abused by somebody, and a lot of harm will, befall the person whose data was involved. All these things, even now, you don't have a data protection law. Even now, we don't have the epidemic.
So this brings us to a very interesting question. What's happened to all that data which was collected through the Arogya Setu app? Who is the custodian and who's the protector of that data? Where does it reside? What is the kind of firewalling which actually insulates and protects it?
Absolutely.
So therefore,
Your guess is as good as mine on this.
yeah,
I really don't know.
and it's a travesty that some of us who actually braved the first wave of COVID-19 without vaccines to sit for long hours doing the data protection bill find that 3 years later India is still bereft of a legal architecture which can insulate and protect people's privacy as well as people's data. And I think perhaps the time has come for all of us to push to ensure that this data protection law actually comes onto the statute books.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because how long can we wait? If you remember, during those 2 years when we braved everything, the amount of consultations that we have had, we brought in several amendments. 92 amendments in about 98 sections. We went line by line, if you remember. But not have a privacy bill introduced in the parliament as of now, even because the previous bill was withdrawn. A new bill has not been introduced. It's only for public consultation. It's really a sad thing, because it is a critical issue, not just for business purpose or ease of doing business, as people of the industry make us believe. It's a question of life itself, of citizens. For any kind of health issue, if we have to meet, we are having the National Digital Health Mission. We are collecting again a huge amount of data. But collecting all such data by the government, which is the largest data fiduciary, and having no legislation to protect the privacy of citizens, is something which for a country like us is really unfortunate. And Manish, I'm sorry for interrupting you. You said very well. You said very correctly that this book, I'm trying to chronicle a series of events in different sectors that happened at that time. So someone who, at this point of time, if he wants to look at that time, because the times have changed, things have changed, even if the pandemic in a different version or the virus in a different version were to come back to India with another wave, we would have lost this knowledge if we had not chronicled it. I hope the government has done it some way. I have done only a modest effort, my own effort, but
I know, but it's a great effort. I must compliment you for that. So to wrap this up, my final question to you would be that individually, as a person, what was your greatest learning of that period?
The only thing finally, if I have to sum up human experience, my personal experience as a human being after these two waves, is to realize that the only certainty in life is death.
Well said. So the only certainty is the full stop at the end.
Is a full stop at the end. But this is the time when human beings, for the first time, this is why they are human beings, they came to the rescue of other fellow human beings. Whether government was there, government was not there were legislations or no legislations. If in a village, this is the good side of it. There was also a very bad example of someone being excommunicated with the fear that the whole village will contaminate and will get contaminated, and therefore being, he being completely, thrown out of the village. And he probably has no recourse to medical advice, medical support, and not even food to eat probably, and dies. So both the human aspects I have seen, and so ultimately I think I'm not being a pessimistic, so being an optimistic, I would say that if we as human beings have to solve some of the society's biggest problems, then we have to not really look up to government all the time, not look up to the coercive measures that are available. As community, by way of cooperation, a number of problems of society, which currently the society is grappling with, can probably be solved. Only problem there is sometimes the government interventions do not allow this cooperation to blossom.
I'll leave a final thought with you, maybe for your next book. Given what we went through, if you were to rewind millions of years in time, somebody needs to reflect on the fact that whether it was a meteor hit which wiped out the dinosaurs, or was it a virus?
Absolutely. 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 Absolutely.
But ladies and gentlemen, this is a great book. I would commend all of you to read it. Dr. Amar Patnaik has done a wonderful job chronicling some of the most difficult moments of our recent history or recent existence. But thank you, Amar, for this great job done.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me and, having gone through the book and, suggesting that we even chronicle it better. And these kind of suggestions will probably, spur me on to write something better. Thank you so much.
Pleasure's all mine. So here we were, ladies and gentlemen, in conversation with author, lawyer, former administrator, and of course a very erudite and articulate parliamentarian, Dr. Amar Patnaik.